Today's webinar will begin in approximately 4 minutes. Today's webinar will begin in approximately 2 minutes. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, Supply Chain Continuity, Risk Management Imperative in a Global Economy, presented by Avolution and MIR3. Please note, this presentation will be available on demand shortly at the end of the webinar. We'll receive an email with details about how to access the recording. The slides will not be made available in any other format. All attendees' phone lines are in listen-only mode. Please use the question and answer tool provided within the webinar tool. To use the Q&A tool, click on the Q&A button at the top of your screen, located at the top of your screen, to ask questions or contribute comments. We'll be taking questions at the end of the presentation. If you have any technical difficulties, you can raise your hand or ask a question using the feedback module on the top right-hand side of your screen. In order to see these tools, you may have to be in normal mode and not full screen mode. Today's webinar will explain the core activities necessary to manage supply chain risk from a business continuity perspective. Our presenters are Brian Zavada from Avolution Consulting, and from MIR3. Brian Zavada is a co-founder and director of consulting for Avolution, a U.S.-based firm that specializes in business continuity consulting, specifically strategy design, development, implementation, and long-term program maintenance in both the public and private sector. Avolution offers a completely customizable business continuity software solution based on the simplicity of Microsoft SharePoint 2010. The Planning Portal is a web-based business continuity software that delivers an easy-to-use set of tools and processes to assist in managing and executing business continuity programs with solutions to address analysis, planning, awareness generation, and exercise planning, as well as collaboration during actual crisis events. Renee Grosstreeter is Vice President of Worldwide Channels and Alliances at MIR3, Inc., the leading developer of intelligent notification and response software, which helps organizations enhance communication abilities, protect assets, and increase operational efficiency. MIR3's technology enables advanced, rapid, two-way mass communication for IT, business continuity, and enterprise operations for more than 85 of the global Fortune 100 companies, as well as government entities, universities, and companies of all sizes in more than 130 companies. With that, I'd like to hand the presentation over to Brian Zulata. Brian?
Thank you very much, Carol, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. Over the next 60 minutes or so, Renee and I are going to be addressing a number of topics related to supply chain risk management and ultimately business continuity. As you can see on the agenda here, we're going to start off with a brief background on a few terms that we're going to be using throughout our discussion today. And then from there, we're going to transition to talking about really the business case for managing supply chain risk. And we'll be using some statistics to reinforce the importance of supply chain risk management. Then we're going to talk a little bit about best-in-class risk treatment strategies, and we're going to divide those in between proactive risk treatment strategies as well as reactive risk treatment strategies following a disruptive event. In preparing for the webinar, we also thought it would be very important to talk about small business concerns and considerations in this space, primarily because there's so many small businesses that are proving to be critical suppliers and business partners of organizations today. And again, like larger businesses, they're just as susceptible, or maybe even more so, to disruption. And then lastly, as part of our conclusion, we're going to introduce briefly our supply chain availability risk management maturity model. And we're going to do that today just by a brief introduction because, again, in the invitation that all of you received when you signed up for this, we will be providing an artifact after the session together with a link to the recorded presentation, and this will be part of those materials. And then again, as Carol indicated, we will conclude with a Q&A and discussion session. All right, so the next slide, please. So over the past 20 years, business observers and analysts have really witnessed an unprecedented outsourcing of select business activities in order to become, I'd say, laser focused on its core competencies, those things that really make them different and stand out. The end result, I think, has really been efficiency and a focus on those differentiators that lead to a competitive edge. And I think the classic example that illustrates this point is, and it's always batted around, is the fact that the world's largest shoe company really doesn't even make shoes any longer. And so again, this is really about, when we talk about the importance of supply chain risk management, it's because so much is being outsourced. There's so many dependencies on other organizations, and it's really caused by, again, that laser focus on core competencies. Next slide, please. So with that serving as the backdrop of our discussion today, I'd like to begin by introducing three terms or points of reference. And the first, I think, that we really have to talk about is the concept of risk. And this first term, it's obviously very basic, but it's one with a surprising number of meanings to so many different organizations. So I thought we would standardize it by using the ISO Guide 73 term, which is the effect of uncertainty on objectives, and in this case, business objectives. So let's go on to the next slide. We'll talk about supply chain for just a moment. I'd like to offer a definition, or at least a description, of supply chain for our discussion today. Supply chains, they can be large or small, and they certainly can differ greatly between organizations that either manufacture a product or even those that are delivering professional services. And the graphic on the bottom of this slide really highlights a notional, maybe a complex international supply chain, where the organization sources product potentially from overseas and eventually delivers that product to the customer domestically. So again, I call it, we talk about a definition of supply chain. Say it's the network of organizations just involved upstream and downstream in different processes and activities that produce value in the form of products and services in the hands of the ultimate customer. Next slide, please. And then for our last definition before we get started into the business case, I'd like to define supply chain risk management, but specifically what we're talking about today is the availability risk aspect of supply chain risk management. Recalling our previous definition of risk, it's really the effect of uncertainty on objectives. What we're really talking about is the uncertainty that contracted products and services are delivered on time and ultimately in the quantity prescribed in order to meet an organization's obligations to its customers. And so supply chain risk management is really the identification of those potential disruptions to continued operations caused by an unexpected loss of a supplier or business partner's product or service. And I think it's important, obviously, to understand the potential causes of the disruption. But if you can go ahead and click the animation there, I think it's really all about reducing vulnerability to an acceptable level. And again, acceptable level within the organization's risk tolerance. And that's what supply chain risk management is really all about. So let's transition for a moment to the business case portion of our webinar. And what Renee and I would like to do is we'd like to introduce a couple of statistics that are certainly influencing organizations to invest in supply chain risk management. And first, there's a recent LoJack report that stated for the first quarter of 2010, there were a total of 222 reported supply chain disruptions, 212 of which were attributed to cargo theft. Now, this is obviously a growing concern and certainly a component, and just one component, of supply chain risk management. Renee, I think you said you were working, with a client that has this specific concern and problem. Do you have any additional comments on that?
Yeah, I sure do. It's very relevant. We have, as mentioned earlier, we have probably 85 to 90 of the Fortune 100 companies, but one of those Fortune 100 companies is one of the largest pharmaceutical services companies operating in the U.S., Canada, Puerto Rico, and Europe. And incidentally, if you can imagine, they do approximately 24,000, they have approximately 24,000 delivery points and 2,000 delivery routes. And each truck, it has a significant amount of pharmaceuticals, which are worth a lot of money. So those pharmaceuticals are very important. It's important to know where they are, how long they're at a particular location, if there's any disruptions. So this particular customer, using business continuity and important message delivery, has approximately 10,000 associates and 36,000 customers on a communication platform. And so what's interesting is they're doing JIT delivery, oftentimes 2 deliveries a day to a data center, and it's important to know where there's disruptions in those supply chains. So they had a couple of critical events, the Denver blizzard, the Chile earthquake, and some other things that were also related to computer systems, IT systems, that impacted their ability to deliver to those endpoints. So they were able to successfully minimize those disruptions using a platform technology.
Great. Thank you, Renee. We'll go to the next slide for some additional, I call it ammunition for our business case. And just recently, the Business Continuity Institute, which is one of the leading professional associations for business continuity professionals, released their 2010 supply chain resiliency study. And what I thought was interesting about it was that 72% of the respondents to the survey experienced at least one disruption in their supply chain, and really the average was 5 disruptions per respondent. And what was also interesting about it was there was a number of, call it, geographical variations in terms of the causes of those supply chain disruptions. So for instance, in the U.S., many of the causes were attributed to health and safety incidents. In Asia Pacific, for instance, civil unrest and environmental incidents were featured much higher. And even in Central and Latin America, cyber threats, terrorism were very highly.
Trabajar por lo que deseas alcanzar siempre trae cosas buenas. Grupo Bancolombia.
Are we able to go ahead and mute that line? I think someone put us on hold. Okay, there we go. So again, we'll go to the next slide for just a moment here, and really the last of our business case information. And in these statistics, which were offered by the Continuity Forum, really talked about how fewer than 20% of the Global 2000 companies, and this was in 2007, work with their key supply chain partners to really embed business continuity management principles in their relationship. And interestingly enough, even fewer, 7%, regularly include partners in exercises or rehearsals, despite the knowledge of the risks associated with the disruption. So those are some of the interesting statistics, again, that I think serve as a backdrop and a business case for moving forward in terms of supply chain risk management. Go to the next slide, please. So in addition to these statistics, there are some very specific events that raise the profile of supply chain disruption recently, or over the last 10 years. Just earlier this year, I think the Icelandic volcano activity certainly featured prominently, where this crippled air traffic in much of Europe for a prolonged period of time, which ultimately led to interruptions even on the ground. I think in 1999 and 2002, the earthquakes in Taiwan had a significant impact on the PC industry. Earthquakes in Japan had major impacts on companies like Toyota and its suppliers. Now, these are natural disasters, but there's certainly, I'll call it, man-made events as well, and examples of that would include the Union Pacific rail strike and the longshoremen strike. Those are two examples generally recently. And then there's even the well-documented case study, really took a look at supply chain risk management with cell phone manufacturers Nokia and Ericsson. And with one organization, that being Nokia, doing a much better job in the supply chain risk management arena, ultimately allowed them to capture market share where one of their competitors faltered and ultimately essentially exited that specific area. So today, much attention is being paid to suppliers, in addition to these events, but also those going bankrupt, and what effect that might have on their obligations. Renee, any other comments?
Yeah, I did. What's also interesting is we see a lot of customers that use communication technology for a lot of these global critical events, and those are what I'd term macro events that impact or disrupt the supply chain. But there's also, we see a lot of micro supply chain issues. Up and down the supply chain, it could be as simple as a low inventory position. It could be as simple as a localized, event that could impact delivery, or that could impact manufacturing, or that could impact the ability to source particular products and services. So we not only look at this from a macro scale, but also from a micro scale specific to even the SMB market, the small medium business market. So, and they can be very disruptive to the supply chain. So knowing and understanding where those are is important.
Okay. Go to the next slide, please. So the statistics that we just outlined and the events that we just talked about are certainly leading to what I call some interesting dialogue between buyers and suppliers. And because of differing perceptions and ultimately, I think, unclear expectations, there's really some tension that has certainly existed in many relationships. And our next slide is going to cover some of these key topics and kind of call them problem statements. They're coming up in some very common conversations between the buyer and supplier. Next slide, please. So when we talk about these topics, we're hearing over and over again is supply chains are far more complex and vulnerable compared to the past. And in many cases, buyers are really searching for information and assurances from their key suppliers. And from the perspective of the supplier themselves, supply chain optimization imperatives for their customers and certain business processes that they're employing, such as lean and just-in-time, are introducing unprecedented risk from their perspective. And suppliers are trying to understand their customers' use of the product and service and stock levels and the like, and they're trying to influence less risky practices, again, to make it a win-win relationship. So So overall, I think buyers are struggling with assessing the risk associated with their supply chains, whereas suppliers are really struggling with defining pragmatic approaches to satisfy their customers. But one area that we're going to be focusing on and exploring in a few moments is ultimately how buyers and suppliers are generally agreeing today that they need to work to define ways to coordinate and communicate at time of disaster, regardless of day-to-day risk. So the next slide, please. So in our business continuity profession, we oftentimes are struggling with finding data that can help us ultimately provide evidence regarding the effectiveness of our planning efforts, or ultimately what's at risk in the absence of planning. And in preparing for this webinar and many conversations I've had with my clients in the past, I've seen a study that was originally produced and authored in 2003, and it was updated in 2005 by Hendricks and Singal, noting just a number of very interesting effects of supply chain disruption. Now, I know there's a lot of text here, and what we tried to do is bold and underline a couple of the key points here that, again, I think really highlights the need and the evidence that this is something that organizations really need to pay attention to. And in the first bullet, we see here again 33 to 40% lower stock returns over a 3-year time period that starts before the disruption. That's significant. We also see, again, for publicly traded companies, much higher degrees of share price volatility, 13.5% higher, as a matter of fact. And when we talk about the average effect of disruption, we see drops in income, lower sales growth, and higher cost in growth, or higher growth in costs following the disruption as well. And the interesting thing about it is when we compare large and small firms, it's much more negative for smaller firms than larger firms because, again, they don't really have the ultimately the redundancy or the bandwidth to be able to navigate that like their larger competitors. So again, there is definite value in mitigating supply chain risk, and ultimately it's a win-win when buyers and suppliers work together to be able to tackle this. Next slide, please. So the disconnect, again, we spent a few minutes framing the issue. Disruptions are commonplace. There's numerous events causing disruption today. And I think it's safe to say that there's relatively minimal interaction between buyers and suppliers, or maybe to put it a better way, there's not enough interaction, or there's probably opportunities for better coordination and planning. So what are the recommended solutions that organizations should consider employing today, again, that we would call pragmatic, or that really make business sense in today's economic environment? So next slide, please. As I introduced when we started the webinar and prepared to be able to talk about what are best-in-class risk treatments, I mentioned that there's really, we kind of group these into two different categories. The proactive risk treatments, those that should be considered prior to a disruption, as well as those that are more reactive, the ones that would be employed at time of a disruption, ultimately to minimize impact. So we'd like to transition the webinar now to a discussion, again, and explore the proactive and reactive. And as we go through some of these slides here, you're going to notice that we're going to have a lot of text. And again, as I mentioned in the kickoff, we are going to have an artifact to share with those that are attending our webinar today, so that this isn't something necessarily that you need to scribble notes down, but we'll be providing this to you afterward, again, to potentially employ within your organizations. So when we take a look at these proactive risk treatments, you see a total of 6 here that are on the slide. And we've, of the first 3, I think they're relatively straightforward. Certainly organizations for many, many years have employed insurance to address business interruption. Where possible, organizations have attempted to apply supplier diversification tactics, especially for extremely important products and services, and where there's not, and where supplier diversification makes sense financially, or even where there's the possibility of engaging a second supplier. And I think a third proactive risk treatment that's utilized effectively, but again, as we saw in the statistics, not as much as it should be, is the use of joint planning and exercising business continuity arrangements between two organizations. I think those are relatively straightforward, but there's three others that Renee and I would like to propose to the group today, and these are the three that probably require a little bit more discussion, and those are contractual mandates or service level agreements, to use another term, assessing supplier risk and what's involved there. And then the sixth would be collaboration, notification, and response. So we're going to take a deeper dive into each of these three next. So next slide. When we talk about contractual mandates or service level agreements, there's definitely a number of attributes of these agreements that we've identified as best in class. And the reason we call them best in class is that they make sense, they're not overly onerous, and they also include the appropriate level of detail to be able to protect the buyer and ultimately set expectations with the supplier. And I think, again, similar to what we did before in one of our, when we highlighted some of the key attributes of the study that was authored by Hendricks, we also highlighted and bolded a couple of key terms here that I'd like to talk about. Now, when we talk about contractual mandates, I think it's very, very important that that mandate has to be very specific in terms of the service or the product that's being asked to protect. Sometimes that's, that sounds commonsensical, but it's sometimes overlooked and become very, very general, and it's open to interpretation. So it's very important that the service or the product be named, that it be described, and day-to-day performance requirements highlighted. I think there also needs to be very specific language around guaranteed recovery timeframes following some sort of a disruptive event. Clearly, suppliers can't prevent every disruptive event, and so it's logical that there has to be a time frame associated with recovery, and that should be called out and agreed to by both parties. And I think it's also very important that contractual mandates include notification between the parties, so that if the supplier does have some sort of an issue meeting its obligations, that there's a specific time frame where notification is mandated and a specific contact at the buyer that's notified when the disruption has taken place and potentially could affect the buyer's interests. Next slide, please. This slide right here offers a continuation of those contractual mandates. And one of the points that I think it's very important to make is to define business continuity planning related processes that the buyer expects the supplier to implement. It's easy, I think, to be able to say, yes, implement business continuity and leave that up to the interpretation of the supplier, but I think calling out specific activities is very important as evidence of an effective risk management posture. I think it's also important that the supplier allow a formal audit if the buyer deems that mandatory. And again, that wouldn't happen in all situations, of course, but perhaps an audit of the supplier's risk management or business continuity capabilities makes sense for very critical suppliers or suppliers that are operating in a high-risk environment. Certainly an SLA would be baseless without a penalty clause, and there needs to be some thought around penalties for nonconformance specific to either business continuity, not establishing appropriate strategies, and the like. And I've seen more and more organizations that have included language recommending that a supplier consult specific standards, and those standards may include the National Fire Protection Association 1600, version 2010 is the latest version, or potentially even the British Standard 25999, version 2007. These are two of the more common standards that are referenced in contractual mandates. The next slide, please. I'd also like to be able to talk about the fifth item we originally talked about, which is assessing supplier risk. And there are certainly a number of factors to consider. And again, because today we're talking about that availability risk portion, I think it's important to take a look at the supplier stability. And there's a number of attributes that could be considered. Changes in the management team indicating stability, violations of various regulatory requirements, and two of U.S. mandates are listed here. Quality issues being a third, and maybe there's just this overall lack of or a lag in response time to just inquiries or communications that might indicate problems. Other areas that are important to consider is financial health of the organization, being able to take a look at their financials and understand overall credit ratings and the like. And then the third is just being able to explore risk management practices. And we're going to take a little bit more of a deeper dive here on that in just a moment. Next slide. When we talk about evaluating risk management strategies, one of the most common ways that buyers are evaluating key suppliers is the use of questionnaires. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Questionnaires can be very effective, but at the same time, they can be open for interpretation. So questionnaires, good. Probably better would be some dialogue. And so for critical supplier relationships or suppliers that are in a high-risk environment, maybe it's worthwhile to use what we're going to introduce here in terms of these questions as discussion points as opposed to simply a question. So there's 7 of them here that we'd like to introduce. The first is, are business continuity strategies in place to really recover business activities associated with the products and services you deliver to the organization? And again, that doesn't mean general business continuity strategies for the whole supplier organization, but those products and services that the buyer cares about. It's a good topic to start with. The second is a discussion around maximum amount of downtime that you'd expect following a disruptive event. Clearly, there's many, many different causes of a disruption. But what is the supplier truly planning for, and what do they see as realistic in the event that the resources that deliver the products and services are impacted? How long could we really be down? And that's an interesting discussion as well, because ultimately comparing their perceptions of downtime to yours and the practices you have internally, it really results in some interesting dialogue. The third is, how do you know that your business continuity strategies will work? And ultimately what you're hoping to get out of that is that the supplier is performing some exercising, or maybe they've actually used these strategies in the past during an actual disruption, and they can talk to you about lessons learned and ultimately what their perception and confidence level of the business continuity strategies. The fourth one is, it really gets down to continuous improvement. How does the supplier track business continuity performance? And how are they really addressing and capturing action items to improve their ability to be recoverable? And again, it sounds pretty straightforward, but what you're looking for here is really the follow-up conversation. What do you see as your biggest issues that you're working on today? And how does that really impact your ability to recover today and protect the buyer's interests? The fifth would be, how do you coordinate with our organization during a disruptive event? It gets back to the issue that I raised earlier in the contractual mandate section, but hey, if you do have a disruption, who are you reaching out to in our organization? How are you getting a hold of us? And how fast are you planning on doing so following the disruptive event? Number 6 is kind of related to that. How would you communicate with internal and external stakeholders to hopefully minimize the impact of the disruptive event? So again, talking about, we talk about the buyer organization in number 5 and getting a hold of us, but how are you going to continually communicate with us to keep us apprised of how the recovery effort's going? And then the last is number 7. What type of communication redundancy do you have in place to ensure continuity of operations? And again, we're going to talk a lot more about that in a little bit in terms of some of the expectations as we get into the next topic. So I'd like to turn it over to Rene now so he can cover the 6th item, collaboration, notification, and the response element.
Thanks, Brian. Obviously, with regards to proactive risk treatments, being able to communicate up and down the supply chain, both for external partners as well as internally with your employees is critical. The ability to launch a pre-built event-specific notification is important so that you know what the message is going to be, you know who the recipients are, you know the escalation options that can be defined if certain recipients aren't available to take action, as well as knowing what to do with the response relative to a pre-built communication strategy. We often think about using best practices to define how you communicate with constituents both internally and externally. And that best practices strategy could include looking at pre-built communications and notifications based on facilities. It could be based on business units or business groups. It could be based on key suppliers in the supply chain that are responsible for key areas of the business, so a number of things. The ability to launch automated notifications based on predefined business exceptions and event triggers is also important. So if there is a particular min and max based on, say, an inventory level or based on some other business parameter, the ability for a communication platform to automatically be flagged when it's outside of those bounds becomes important, because speed is critical. So the ability to launch that notification in sub-seconds and then get a response, and that response then can be acted upon is important. And then automatically being able to cascade multiple notifications. So the ability to, once a communication strategy is evoked, then what's the response to that relative to cascading to other potential groups? For instance, you can do that by individual. So if you have a key critical supplier or a key critical individual responsible for a supplier, they are notified, and if they can't be reached, then it goes to the next available person. As well, on a more macro communication perspective, if you want to launch notifications that then you take a subset of those responses and cascade another notification to those responses that are yes, no, maybe, or any derivation thereof, then that can be invoked as well. And then obviously automatic message escalation. So if you can't reach particular individuals or suppliers, who are the next available individuals, maybe higher up the food chain or alternate suppliers that you can ask the question and get a response. And then ultimately, for proactive risk treatment, is the ability to audit and report based on what that notification response is, and how you basically manage that whole incident. So there's an element of incident management here as well. Next slide, please. So really, when you're looking at inventory management, procurement, transportation, on the inventory management side, you know, where is the inventory? How many suppliers are responsible for that inventory? Is there risk associated with that? You know, managing that inventory to the degree of where is it and how much do you have of that inventory is critical. Procurement, how much is acquired for the management of the supply chain? You know, essentially how much, what quantities, what level, and basically what's the approach to procurement, and how long does that take to go through the procurement cycle? And then, of course, transportation management. The diversity of transportation, or being able to divert certain transportation elements to others when an event does occur is critical, particularly if you're delivering important goods to a location. What wraps around all of these three is an effective communication collaboration platform that's also global, that has the ability to globally touch multiple languages in multiple countries, multiple facilities, to effectively and best manage the whole process. So next slide, please. So now we're going to change to a little bit what are the reactive risk treatments, and I'll pass it back to Brian to just talk about, you know, when an event does occur, what do you do to mitigate that risk now that an event has occurred?
Okay, thank you, Renee. And as a reminder, everyone, for those that are listening, I know we've had a hard time doing a mute on all attendees, so we have some feedback. We're hearing some voices in the background. If you're not on mute, could you please go ahead and mute your phone, and we really appreciate that. Thank you. Again, building on the reactive risk treatments for a moment, as Renee just talked about, there's certain information needs during a crisis that an organization has. The information is needed to be able to effectively make and reach conclusions during a situation assessment, and also to be able to go ahead and ultimately employ the appropriate response and recovery strategies. So information needs during a crisis, facility and equipment loss, certainly. Issues with people in terms of casualties or an inability to report to work or an inability to support the recovery effort. Other resource availability like IT, raw materials and finished goods availability. And that's really it's that last one that becomes so critically important because when we're talking about supply chain risk management, ultimately when can the raw materials and finished goods become available? And again, I think, as we talk about reactive, it gets back to collaboration again. And so I'll turn it back over on the next slide to Renee to talk a little bit more about that reactive collaboration.
463, veo 463 ahí. 463 y 358 abajo.
I hope we didn't lose Renee.
Nope, I'm here.
Okay.
Sorry. So with regards to reactive risk treatments, really we're looking at the key success factors in responding to a crisis. Essentially communicating the existence of an event and tracking that incident and everything that goes around that incident, the ability to do that, communicating unforecasted needs, and oftentimes when an event does occur, do you understand all the particular requirements to address that disruption? So communicating unforecasted needs becomes important because oftentimes there's many things that come up that you never thought of. Communicate direction to suppliers. So, how do you communicate with those suppliers what to do next, or to basically hold inventory or escalate inventory requirements and whatnot. And then ultimately it's leveraging communication technology. Today, communication technology has been at the forefront and is basically so much different than it was even 5 years ago. And there's a lot of great technology out there that includes notification technology, voice over IP, that includes multiple devices that you can use. Also, things like BlackBerry pin-to-pin when there's an outage over a network, the ability to still communicate with people. Those things are important and effective. And also leveraging a global enterprise communication platform becomes critical, particularly if you're a large enterprise. And we always think of the words response is everything, because at the end of the day, it's not just one-way communication. What's critical is knowing what the recipient's issue is and then being able to respond. So speed is critical, and essentially being able to act upon that response is critical. So if you're just sending messages out, and this is pervasive in email, if you're just sending messages out and you can't consolidate responses, or you don't get responses, or you don't even know if they got the email, that disables you to create action based on that response. Next slide, please. Okay, so what are some of the reactive risk treatments that we've found over the 10, 15 years we've been doing this that fail? Number one, many organizations we still know are using manual call trees. And the area there that's the function is time is critical. It takes time to make make phone calls and try to reach people in a quick time, even if those call trees are small. Oftentimes you may not have the right phone numbers, you may not know who to call. One person in the chain of the call tree may not be able to make the calls, and then you've impacted a significant percentage of the folks that can respond. Email messaging, that's often used in both supply chain and crisis management and business continuity planning. The challenge is today recipients are more mobile than they ever have been, and oftentimes we don't even know where they may be. They could be working remotely, they could be in the office, they could be out on a customer site, so they can be in a manufacturing distribution center, we just don't know. And the challenge is email is one way, and it's typically one device. And it does not really provide the efficient means to collecting responses. So if you can imagine, if you send emails to 50 suppliers and the ability to get all those responses back in a meaningful time and knowing if they actually got the email and then consolidating all the responses can be time-consuming and difficult. And we know that when there's a disruption, time is of the essence, time is critical. And basic supply chain notification, we see a lot of times there's a lot of supply chain applications out there that are fantastic that manage and monitor the supply chain. However, they typically have very basic notification technologies that oftentimes include one way, one device, and typically it's email. Oftentimes we see those notification strategies lacking a lot of intelligence. And intelligence in a communication strategy is important, and it enables you to react and respond much more quickly. As Brian mentioned earlier about the shoe company where they're not making shoes, the supply chain is critical. I would argue that communication is as critical in the supply chain, because when you lack intelligence in your communication strategy, it equals more time, more money, and can impact the business as well as potentially impact lives. So next slide, please. So don't let this slide scare you, but a couple of things here I just want to point out. This is a typical diagram we have of our IAN Enterprise product. It's an enterprise notification platform, but what's important is on the left side the ability to evoke a communication or notification, and that should be able to be done with a web interface through email. If you send an email, it can actually launch a notification. If there's a critical event and there's what we call a smoking hole and the building is down, the ability for somebody to call a support line and launch a pre-built notification, or even using what we call IAN Console or a command line interface through IT to be able to launch notifications that can also be pre-built and automated, and then using any kind of phone, plain old telephone system to launch a notification. On the right, you have multimodal approach to receiving notifications as well as responding. The only response there back that's difficult is fax, obviously, but the rest you can get response options on all of these device types. And that's important. I mentioned earlier BlackBerry using the BES server and RIM network pin-to-pin. That's pretty exciting because it shows up bold and red on a BlackBerry device is also beneficial. And I just want to point out the center diagram just is kind of depicting MIR3 is used predominantly in this environment as a SaaS application. And the benefit is there's very little disruption or management from IT, and more importantly, oftentimes people look at this diagram and think, wow, that's really for an enterprise, but oftentimes because it's software as a service based, we have 7 data centers throughout the world serving thousands of MIR3 customers, both from the small customer to the large customer. The interesting thing is the cost to implement such a solution is very low because it's software as a service. So the small, medium business can very effectively implement a communication and risk mitigation strategy very cost effectively. And that's why when we look at companies using email or call trees, it's very easy to look at the return on investment and very quickly move to automated communication strategy like MIR3. So that brings me to the next slide, which is, oftentimes we have to look at the small, medium business because they're critical to the supply chain, and how can they implement better risk mitigation strategies and communication platforms. So I'm going to hand this back to Brian to talk about the SMB considerations.
Okay, thanks so much, Renee. And, again, I think we'd be remiss if we failed to highlight, again, the fact that a growing number of critical suppliers, they're smaller enterprises, and building on the dialogue we introduced earlier between our notional buyer and supplier, ultimately the buyer's looking at this and saying, I have a number of small businesses as key suppliers. What should I be doing with them? Should I be doing something differently with them? And whereas the supplier might indicate, hey, I'm a small business with limited resources compared to my competitors, what should I be doing potentially? And so on the next slide, I think the bottom line here is that unfortunately for smaller businesses, they ultimately should be on the receiving end of relatively similar expectations, again, regardless of their size. And by investing in thinking about business continuity on their end and making their customers feel good about their preparedness efforts, that ultimately can be a competitive differentiator. It can certainly preserve market share or preserve that customer relationship, and certainly it might ultimately lead to winning business, especially for organizations that are extremely focused on risk management. And so if we're thinking about, I'll go to the next slide now, please, 5 key actions that a small business supplier should consider taking. The first I'd say is really understanding customer expectations, and as part of that is understanding their flexibility the customer's flexibility to address periods of time when your products and services would be unavailable. And now most organizations, even if they're employing lean and just-in-time principles, they can handle some period of downtime. But how much? And ultimately, how do you plan to address those expectations? I think the second is taking inventory of what it takes to deliver your critical products and services to your customers, and that includes facilities, people, equipment, technologies, other materials. And how might you resume production or delivery using alternate resources and processes if you were called upon to do so? Again, it's impossible to be able to replicate an entire business, particularly as a small business. But what are some of the ways you could speed the recovery process along? And that gets into number 3, identifying single points of failure and your dependencies on others, just like your customers are dependent on you. And understand the vulnerabilities that exist as a result. I think documenting a plan is very important. It helps with repeatability. It summarizes key procedures to respond and recover. And ultimately, it should also emphasize how you intend to communicate internally with suppliers, business partners, customers, both at the onset of a disruptive event and throughout the course of a crisis. And lastly, again, regardless of the size of your organization, it's completely conceivable that you should be able to practice your response and recovery effort. Use scenario-based discussions and ensure all of your most critical employees understand your firm's business continuity approach and their individual roles and responsibilities. So I'd like to go to the next slide and conclude for a moment. And as a matter of fact, we actually already had a question that was submitted about an artifact that we're going to be providing afterwards to attendees. And again, we'll be providing that via email, as well as a link to this slide deck that we've recorded today. Or really the presentation, not the slide deck. But one of the artifacts that we're going to provide is a summary of today's discussion captured in a maturity model type format. And what you're going to see, I want to set the stage for what you'll see via email. And ultimately, it's, again, built around defining, refining, measuring, and managing. And you'll see in there when you receive this via email that ultimately it breaks down considerations in a maturing way of how do you assess supply chain risk? How are you consulting with your suppliers? What are the contractual requirements and mandates that you have in place? And ultimately, what are the risk mitigation strategies that you're employing? And again, I think there's we've seen specifics in each of these 4 categories, again, for defining, refining, measuring, and managing. And hopefully some of the thought, when you receive this, you'll be able to see where you fit in and ultimately how you can essentially continue your journey to being able to manage this critical element of your organization. The next slide, please. Well, I'd like to conclude with just a couple key points and summary details. First off, it's impossible to eliminate supply chain risk and avoid working with single or sole source supplier relationships. It's just impossible. But there are ways to go ahead and manage through that event through a constant recurring analytic approach and really exploring ways to be able to affect risk management principles in the individual key critical supplier, as well as potentially the ways in which you work with your suppliers and whether it be inventory levels or whether it contingent supplier relationships that you could employ if a key business partner was to become unavailable. I think it's important to work to decrease vulnerability and the likelihood of impact, and it gets back to some of the things that Renee talked about earlier, whether it be single points of failure on the transportation front. It might have to do with inventory management or even really procurement and what you maintain in your organization in terms of safety stock. And again, collaboration, communication, and response. That's kind of the common thread and theme that we heard throughout today's discussion. And being able to be, have good proactive communication with your suppliers. Work with them. Don't make it an us versus them, but work with them in terms of risk management. And at the same time, prepare to communicate with them in the event of a disruptive event. And one other point I'd like to bring up, and it's not something we've talked about or spent a whole lot of we've made any reference to for that matter, and that's the concept of the private sector preparedness initiative here in the United States, and where there's going to eventually be I'll call it a government-sponsored organizational certification initiative, and many business continuity professionals feel that the #1 driver for organizations thinking about becoming certified is customer assurance or market differentiation. And so a lot of what we talk about today in terms of thinking about supply chain risk management, as a buyer, I'm trying to mitigate my risk. As a supplier, I'm trying to make my customer comfortable that we're doing everything we can to protect their business needs specific to our product and service. And so I think that if ultimately you fall into that category as a supplier, I definitely would encourage you to learn more about this, because I think 2011 will be a key point when this effort is rolled out. And there might be some customers or buyers asking their suppliers to consider certification as evidence of their preparedness efforts. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Carol, and perhaps we can address a few questions over the remaining 5 minutes that we have.
Brian, I'd like to remind everyone, if you have questions for either Brian or Renee, to utilize the Q&A tool that's built into the webinar, and that is on the upper left-hand side of your screen. When it's in normal mode, you may have to switch from full screen mode. And also as a reminder to keep your phones on mute. We're accepting questions through the Q&A tool. The first question here is about notification, and it's for Renee. How does your notification platform address the needs of global organizations for supply chain risk management?
That's a great question. Obviously, with a number of companies, whether you're a global company and you have offices, internationally, or you are a local and domestic company, you might have suppliers, and most likely will have suppliers that are international. The ability to communicate globally is critical. So we find a lot of customers wanting to be able to communicate multimodal, both in the United States as well as Canada, and throughout other parts of the world. Obviously, Central Europe, the EMEA region, and APAC, Australia, and the Middle East, and areas like that might become critical depending on the requirements of your company. So MIR3 provides a global platform. We have 5 data centers in the U.S. and Canada, and 2 data centers in Europe, also adding telephony servers in a couple of other countries. So hopefully that answers that question.
Brian, I think this one is for you. Can you clarify the activities that are one-time tasks versus recurring risk management techniques?
Sure, Carol. I think, it's interesting because in many ways, I don't think there's anything that is truly just a one-time technique. And if we revisit some of those proactive risk treatments we talked about before, for instance, insurance, well, that's recurring. Looking at supplier diversification efforts, that's always recurring because, of course, the business environment's changing. Joint planning and exercises, well, those should be recurring as well. Contractual mandates, well, you might have a contract that's in place for some period of time, but it will certainly expire, and there's going to be a need to revisit that. And again, so I contend that's recurring. The assessment of a supplier's risk profile, that's absolutely recurring, primarily because of the fact that that the environment's changing for that supplier just like it's changing for your organization. And thinking through communications, again, I think collaboration before an event in order to improve a risk profile, recurring, and certainly practicing and preparing for the reactive type communications, also recurring as well. So, that's my long drawn out answer to say I don't think there's anything that's a one-time event.
Thank you, Brian. I believe this next question is for Renee. How easy is it to implement and integrate the communication technology that you spoke about to multiple back-end systems?
That's a great question. Oftentimes we see companies starting to use notification technology for crisis management and business continuity. I know there's probably a lot of business continuity professionals on the phone today that are familiar with notification and business continuity planning tools. But also, when you start to look at business operations or enterprise operations, which, supply chain and other areas of the organization, it can become important. We see companies using notification technology or communication technology for event management, marketing and sales, supply chain, a whole other host of business processes. And that bolsters the value proposition for the crisis management team because, obviously sometimes notification technology as part of business continuity planning has a difficult ROI to quantify. But when you start to approach the business side, it's more digestible. Importantly, the ability to, launch a notification platform is pretty easy. We can have a customer up and running in under 48 hours because it's a SaaS platform, and the ability to send notifications worldwide can be done. Integrating with back-end systems is important for the business side, the business operations side, so we have a number of applications that help us do that very quickly, our ESB product, for instance, but the ability just to integrate with an HR system, integrate with a supply chain management database system like Maximo and other things like that can be easily done with our drag and drop GUI integration tool. And we have a number of strategies to do that. We typically don't see a lot of professional services being used in our solution, which is nice, and we see the majority of our customers implementing our solution both for business continuity and business operations. But the important point is the solution works, it's SaaS, and there's very little effort in integrating with back-end systems.
Okay.
Thank you, Renee. I think we have time for one more question. This one is for Brian. Is it even possible to mitigate all supply chain-oriented risks? We haven't done a lot because we often feel it's nearly insurmountable task. Can you highlight a couple of quick wins?
Yeah, I don't think it's possible in any setting to mitigate all supply chain oriented risk. I think that simply being able, if we're going through a process of assessing the supply chain and understanding critical suppliers and understanding the organization's vulnerability based on a dependency on key suppliers, knowing that information is already a big win. And where you start looking at, if we're talking about prioritization, that's also a quick win. Being able to kind of start from a top down and being able to, again, either consult with that supplier to help them think through appropriate risk management techniques, be able to work with the supplier around inventory management and being able to make sure all products and services aren't in one location when you compare those products and services between the supplier and the customer. Those are all wins. Being able to, even if it's just being able to prepare to transition to an alternate supplier, even if there's not a capacity or it would take so much effort to be able to fully go through the process of sourcing an alternate. Again, just preparing to that transition if a disruption or some sort of a catastrophic event occurred. Again, another quick win. So, there's going to be places where it makes a lot of sense to identify an alternate supplier, and it's going to be completely realistic to do so. But there's going to be places where it's not. And the economy's led to that type of a situation in terms of many organizations that have simply disappeared that could have offered that level of redundancy. And again, it might be expensive to ask a key partner to be able to stand up a capability they can't do right now. And so those are things that need to be considered. And so it's not possible to mitigate everything in all situations with all key suppliers, but there's enough homework that can be done to speed that process along if the unexpected did occur.
Thank you very much, Brian. I think we have run out of time. There are still a couple of questions that have been asked, and we will be following up with those in email with the people who have asked them. This concludes our webinar. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us, and as a reminder, you'll receive an email follow-up with instructions on how to download the presentations, the webinar, and also the artifacts that Brian spoke about. Thank you.